Welcome, everyone. It is the final session of the day. I know it's been a day that has been full of curiosity and ideas, hopefully some light bulb moments, some collaboration and kindling of new connections. My name is Kat Shugrue dos Santos. I use she, her, hers, or anything respectful as my pronouns. And I am the executive director of Fresh Youth Initiatives, an organization that works with young people and their families in Washington Heights. And I am the president and CEO of Shugrue dos Santos Consulting, or SDS Consulting. And it is in that capacity that I'm here. I'm really excited to moderate this panel. This panel needs very little moderation. They are amazing, and we will all be in a collaborative conversation. So I'm very excited. I'm also really excited to be here in this conference. One of the things I do is I co-chair with Jean Johnson from CJI Hearts, which is a coalition in New York City that was formerly the Coalition on Working with Abusive Partners. And we have reformed and relaunched with a more transformative justice focus and equity focus. Hearts stands for Healing, Equity, Accountability, Restoration, Transformation, Safety. And we are so excited to be part of this conversation. Next slide, please. I want to introduce you to our amazing panelists today. We have Maddalynn Sesepasara from Kunane, Project Manager in the Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, and Maddie's colleague, Kunane Dreier, who uses he, him pronouns, Director of Training and Program Development, also from the Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. We have Barbara Gibson from the Housing Services Director for the Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence. And Barbara, that's in Georgia, correct?
Yes, it is.
Atlanta. And my chosen family and colleague, Darlene Torres from the New York City Anti-Violence Project is also with us. Darlene uses she, her as her pronouns, and we've worked together for a very long time. Next slide, please. So, excuse me, during our panel today, we've already gotten some really great questions that folks asked when you registered for this panel and for the conference. But we also want you to continue to submit the questions that come up as you are listening to us and maybe that are sitting with you after today. So there'll be a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and add questions for us. We will do our best to get to those questions, or at least lift up themes from them that are common. We don't have that much time together, so we may not get to all of them, but we're excited to involve you and engage you in the conversation. You're going to be hearing from each of the panelists and the represented organizations that they are here from in the order that's on your screen right now. And then we'll gather together in a discussion format, and we will answer those questions that we've received and also simply have, hopefully, what is a real generative conversation. Thank you so much. If we can go to the next slide. All right, we are going to start with Kunane, who's going to talk with us on cultural humidity and knowing our place.
Hi, aloha everyone. Kunane Dreier here in Honolulu, he, him, oya pronouns. And thank you again for the invitation to be here, Maddie and myself, to be here to talk a little bit about our program and how do we, when we talk about trauma-informed responsiveness and things like this, coming from a community here in Hawaii that's very eclectic and very culturally based. We'll go through our slides really quickly and looking forward to the discussion. Next slide. So here, we work at Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, and this is our mission statement: and reducing harm, promoting health, creating wellness, and fighting stigma in Hawaii and the Pacific. Oh, and I need to slow down the interpreters. I too speed up, but I truly believe our agency works with and supports and serves communities that aren't understood, and many other agencies and programs just don't know how to. And when I say that, I'm talking about our LGBT community, our Mahu community, our people living with HIV, hepatitis, substance use, mental health, right? Even our Native Hawaiian community here in our own island. And so how do we best support people when we know that there's programs out there that just don't understand or don't know how to? And I like to believe that versus saying they don't want to. Yes. Next slide. So we are at the intersection of criminal justice, HIV, mental health, substance use. There's no wrong door. Somebody will come in, domestic violence. Our Kunane project that you're going to hear about talks about the amazing work they do with our transgender or our Mahu community. Next slide. Again, and Maddie's going to talk a little bit about the project she manages, the Kunane project. And this is where it really stands strong for us, because when we talk about creating a safe space, the Kunane project is our social service project run for our transgender community, run by our transgender community, and it's really important that we have a safe space for our community to come to. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Maddie to talk a little bit about cultural humility and our Mahu community. So next slide. Oh, me first. Yeah, Maddie, you want me to do this slide? Okay, dynamics of culture. So it's really important for all of us to understand when we think about culture and within the communities and the people we serve, it's not everybody walking through the door comes from the same background, right? We know that culture, right? Our customs, our rituals, our communication, our languages, our practices are different, right? There's dynamics of culture within communities, within sub-communities, within these smaller little pockets. And that's so important because we cannot have one blanket program, one blanket service. Everybody cannot get the same thing, right? And so that's really important to understand. So now next slide. So the dynamics of the culture, and we used to always call it, I'm culturally competent because I sat in this training for this last 10 minutes and listened to Kunane speak. So now I know all about our Mahu or LGBT community. Not true, even for someone from the community. We're not connected to the entire community. So I like to say cultural humility, when I can go and interact with someone and have this humility, this cultural humility, so that I can learn and understand who's sitting in front of me and all these different aspects that may or may not impact this person's life and who they are. We can have such an amazing, profound impact. Now it's our friend Maddie to talk about Mahu, and we have 5 minutes. Gosh, we got to talk fast.
Okay, so my turn. So now we're going to talk about culture and this is Hawaiian culture, Mahu especially. So Mahu is our focus. Next slide. So when it comes to identifying our LGBT folks in old Hawaii history, this is how they refer to their folks. Aikani referred to cohibit as male with male or female with male, but they also had roles. When it came to Noho Aikani, that referred to them sitting at the table. They sat with their people, they had important roles and they knew their roles and what their responsibility were. And they had these high roles with especially with our royal court, our ali'is, they're very respected. Now, when it came to Moi Aikani, this referred to having a relationship with each other, with male or female with female. And it was common. I apologize about the phone ringing, but it was common, having this relationship was not taboo. It was nothing bad. It was just a part of life. Excuse me real quick. Now, when it came to our Mahu folks, this really referred to our transgender, our non-binary folks. These were individuals that were born male. They carried the feminine, the soft traits of a female. And this was also a way of identifying someone that was born with both sexes. They were called Mahu, or they're just homosexual of either sex. Next slide, please. Here we have documentation that we did exist and that we did belong here and that we're here. Here Reverend Cochran Forbes states in his journals in 1838 saying, one man who has never dressed in male costume from birth now labors under conviction. He appears truly humble, but says he does not know how to change his dress. I told that I told him that if he would be a follower of Jesus, he must make no reservation, but must be willing to sacrifice everything. Poor fellow, he has a hard conflict with pride, but the sinner must be willing to do anything for Christ. So again, this is when the missionaries come in and they're telling us that our beliefs, our cultural ways is wrong, and that what they say is right, and that's horrible. So here again, we have documentation that our people do exist. Next slide. Again, Mahu in Hawaii, again, understanding Mahu is a respected, this is our culture term. This is something our people came up with when identifying someone that is Mahu or Aikane. Mahu were part of the fabric of society. We're part of our culture. We were respected, we were valued, we were caretakers, we were healers. We had very respected roles in our community. Our Hawaiian culture recognizes that Mahu is a respected identity for being transgender. Mahu folks understand their kulana, what their roles were, and what their kuleana is, their responsibility. And that's all it was. If you understand your kulana and you understand your kuleana, then you understand where you belong in your community. So that's the brilliance about our Hawaiian folks. They were on it, honey. Next slide. And here you see in other countries, other places around the world, that have their own way of identifying their transgender person and the roles that they played. They had very respected roles. And we have to understand that before Western influence, there was our own culture. There was our own beliefs and our own ways of practices of life. When you understand that, then you understand Western influences means nothing. Sorry, moving on. Ohana, biologic versus Hanai. Kunane, can you do this part?
Yes, perfect. So what's important, especially from a cultural lens, if we're thinking about people who are coming into our programs, and thank you, Maddie, we think about ohana or family, right? In our community, biological or hanai, we don't know who's going to come, who's their support system. Hawaiian culture, it's a community. So you definitely don't know who's going to show up at your door. And also in our LGBT community, support systems and family looks different because not all of us can be are blessed with biological family supporting us through our entire lifetime. That's important to know. And then here, we know intimate partner violence. This is a quote from a friend of mine who told me one time, the more her partner hit her, the more she believed that was love, right? And maybe someone like him would not come back around again. So she didn't want to address the intimate partner violence that was going on. As a transgender, as a Mahu individual, she felt that she didn't have many choices. And so intimate partner violence, even within our culture, from a cultural lens, can be quite traumatic. And we have one last slide. What we know from our community here, and we're going to answer some more questions in the question part, but just like across the Western society, our girls here, our community here, lack of trust just in the whole system, right? Because of what they've experienced when they walk through the doors. And so when we think about our Ku'ana project and what support and safety it provides, is amazing. With that, I'll stop and we'll turn it over and we'll get to share a little more during the Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kunane and Maddie. Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Gibson with the Women's Resource Center. We're based here in the Metro Atlanta of Georgia. And I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Housing Services Director. And my presentation is mostly about what happens at the Safe House, but also about the Women's Resource Center. The next slide, thank you. One of the things I really want to emphasize for us all is that we're doing really important work. And sometimes it can feel like the work is bigger than our energy, bigger than our passion. And that's just not the case. It's something that we must do, and we must do it even if it doesn't feel like we're making the progress that we think that we could or we should, because it's the right thing to do as human beings who are in relationship with other people who are part of the world. So we have to act as if it was possible to radically transform the world that we live in. And we have to do it all the time. Doesn't mean that we have to do it to our exhaustion. We rest when we need to, but the important thing is to begin again as many times as we need to. A little bit about the history of the oh, sorry. So this is a little bit about oh, it's okay, Brittany, I can say it on the next slide. A little bit about the Women's Resource Center. We were created in 1986 when a woman by the name of Natasha Trethewey's mother, Gwendolyn Burnett, was unfortunately murdered by her estranged husband. That was in 1985. And we were created in 1986. Today, we offer a number of programs, including emergency shelter at the Safe House, legal advocacy, aftercare programs, including transitional housing. What we're really concerned with is providing people with support over the long term, because we want to recognize that violence is a personal, individual experience, but it's also part of a cultural fabric. And that has an impact on who you are, what you think is possible for yourself, and also your sense of self over time. So healing takes quite a lot of community involvement. It takes quite a lot of community support. And that really is our intention. We're thinking about providing services not just to help a person stabilize physically, but also emotionally. Some real consideration about around your wholeness and your well-being. And that's something that happens in community where you have a sense of belonging and connection, and you really feel like people see who you are and care about your well-being. So services are beyond crisis toward wholeness. The next slide. One of the things I want to emphasize is our demographics. And of course, here you see the people that we are serving. This is primarily at the Safe House itself. And of course, we understand that domestic violence happens across cultures, across communities. No community is exempt from domestic violence, regardless of your gender identity, your income, your education. I'm just emphasizing primarily the people, given where we are in Metro Atlanta, who are served at the Safe House. And why is this important? Because if we think about the social location of the people that we're serving, many, as you see here, receive safety net services, and so maybe don't have the same access to resources. And if we think about the compounding disadvantages, that can impact the way that a person shows up for services. And although I also present as a cisgender Black woman, my social location is in many ways very different. And so I might assume that there is some sameness, and of course there is. But I also want to be mindful about the places where it can feel like they are interacting with the system rather than a person in front of them. And I want to be mindful of that as I'm interacting with each person. I have to work a little bit harder to establish some trust, because especially if you've been accessing systems and you've been going to places where people were not maybe kind to you or made you feel like you had to jump through hoops, um, the shame that's associated with having to apply for SNAP, food stamps, all these types of services can leave a bad taste in your mouth, so that when you access other services, even if people are saying that they're being friendly, it can have a sense of overwhelm. You just have exhaustion about it. And so it's really important how you show up in services, so that the person in front of you know, I see you, I care about what your experience is, and you are an individual. You're not just another number who's presenting in front of me for a service. That's important, even if the person looks very much like you. Next slide. So, what we really want to emphasize here is the idea that healing is possible. We know that survivors obviously experience trauma. We also want to be mindful that we too experience trauma. We have all survived our own kinds of things. And so, it's important for us to find a way to deal with ourselves first, so that the way that we show up in front of the people that we're serving does not cause further harm. So, what does that mean? I center myself. I have full intention to be present with the person that I'm working with. I see a whole person, not just a problem to be solved. I embrace what the experience is with this person. And I offer my deep listening, because being really seen, being really heard, having somebody be an embodied witness can be really healing. So that means I have to present with a regulated nervous system, because energy is contagious. And when I'm regulated, I can lead the other person into regulation, which again is healing. I can normalize that if I've been through a lot of trauma, that of course fight and flight might come up, that my sense of trust might be compromised, my access to choice might also be compromised. And so I really want to be able to, again, normalize that and name it and help the person move through it rather than making them feel bad about how they are presenting in the moment. Next slide. Also, we recognize that violence is prevalent in our culture. It's culturally supported. And so, how can we find ways to interrupt that? How can we challenge our own ways of being, thinking, talking, interacting with other people that contribute to this culture of violence? Because our work is not just the 9 to 5 of ending violence, it's also about how we view the world and how we are engaging with the world and the people and the systems in it. And as we are moving throughout our days and interacting with people, we want to bring a beginner's mind. We don't want to assume that we know anything because we don't. Every situation is different, every person is different. So we bring, again, a beginner's mind because when we think we already know, that's a barrier to clear seeing. And we make people invisible, which gets in the way of a real relationship and a real opportunity to build rapport and see what's happening for the other person rather than what we think might be happening or assuming what they might need. Next slide. We also want to make sure that we practice good care for ourselves. So, advocates and service providers must include emotional health and well being as a priority, right? Because if we are working with people and we're not careful about the way that we show up, again, we could cause harm. So, we sip as we pour. We include ourselves in our own work and our care. And we're mindful too that we are not all the same people, regardless of whether we are receiving services or offering services. But at the same time, all people have been touched in some way by trauma. And having survived wounds is not an excuse to cause pain. So we want to be able to recognize what's happening with ourselves, bring a level of self-awareness so that we can recognize what's happening as it's arising. We can put the fire out before we respond to what's happening in the moment so that we don't cause harm. And that's it. I made it to the 10 minutes. Thank you all so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you in the question and answer session.
Hi, this is Darlene Torres. I use she and her pronouns. I am the Director of Client Services at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. And I'm excited to be with all of you in community. Feels pretty good so far. Next slide, please. Well, let me put my timer. Give me 1 second so I could time myself. Okay, so AVP, for folks who may not be aware, our mission is to empower LGBTQ and HIV affected communities and allies, aspiring allies, to end all forms of violence through organizing education and support survivors through our counseling and advocacy and many other programs in our direct services, part of the agency. We envision a world in which all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV affected people are safe, respected, and live free from violence. We have an array of services for survivors who experience violence directly, or those who don't experience violence directly, but who are experiencing, who are in community with those who are experiencing violence. We have a 24-hour hotline. We offer counseling services, advocacy services, our legal services. We also have economic empowerment services. We have an amazing community organizing and leadership development team. We do public advocacy, and we offer training and technical assistance. And most of that is free. So give us a call if you feel like you like some of that support at your agency. I can't see the bottom part because of the boxes.
You want me to jump in, Darlene?
Oh, I got it. I did it. I moved it. I moved the picture, the beautiful faces that I was looking at. Our approach at AVP, we work really hard to be anti-oppressive and to be trauma-informed. We recognize that we are always aspiring to be anti-oppressive, and we are all aspiring allies in one shape or form or another. But we believe in centering the communities that we are serving, right? They know what they've been through, they know what they need, and they know where they want to go. So we are just supporting them, and they are in the driver's seat, as most of us already know. Next slide, please. So beyond the binary, I've been doing queer anti-violence work probably for 25 years. And the way that I was trained long ago, 25 years ago in the movements, and when I say movements, I mean the domestic violence movement, the sexual violence movement, was really thinking about who's the survivor and who is the person that's causing harm, right? And we know, as you've been talking about all day today, this is often a conversation that is very binary. It's either one or the other. So at AVP, we really try to think about and push ourselves in having conversations around what does it mean when folks don't fit within the binary? And why are we thinking in the binary, right? What does it mean for us as providers to think in the binary? You know, and how does that create a space really more of comfort for us than actually looking at the person who we are talking with, who is sharing their narrative with us and their story, and how are we being present for them and fully taking in the entire experience. And that is difficult, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. Oh, I need to move my little pictures here. So again, just recognizing intersecting identities, you know, at AVP, we work with people across the spectrum of gender identity, across the spectrum of sexual orientation, at the layers of race and class and age and ability, you know, and really, again, taking in the entire person and what that means for their experience in experiencing harm, but also what does it mean for an individual who's causing harm, who has all of these layers of identities that we are looking at and thinking about and really making sure that they are part of the work and the conversation around what is needed in these moments when we're interacting with them. Next slide, please. We aspire to be culturally specific, LGBTQ culturally specific. It doesn't mean that we know it all, right? Because we don't, but it means that we are really listening to what the community is naming that they need, right? What does it mean to be inclusive and affirming? Because in my experience doing this work for so long and working at AVP over time, there was once upon a time where, yeah, we felt like we were super inclusive, right? People wanted to come to AVP because they felt that they would get a really good experience out of us. And then we realized, okay, some of us, we do identify with being part of the community, we're in community, and it doesn't mean that we always know. It doesn't mean that we are always affirming, because we are all bringing ourselves into the space, right? And fully, what does it mean to fully bring ourselves into the space and also suspend a lot of what we've learned over time in how to do the work and how to hear someone's story and someone's narrative, how we're suspending our own experiences in those moments to fully be present. And so in having many of these conversations over the years and over time, we started to really look at our programming and really thinking about, wow, that was fast. Really thinking about how our programming needed to shift. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So we look at the survivor, and we're looking at the work that we're doing to support survivors. And then when we think about prevention, we weren't actually looking at the people causing harm. We weren't having those conversations with folks causing harm, right? We were putting a lot of the burden on the survivors, as we sometimes do in these movements, right? Where the survivor has to change everything in their life to try to seek safety. So we flipped it over and said, okay, let's start talking to the folks causing harm. Let's start developing programming for folks who cause harm. And that's what we did. Next slide. And we know that when we are looking at IPV and DV in this heteronormative paradigm, we know that we're missing a whole lot of people, right? That we're not really looking at how people of color, gay, bisexual men are experiencing IPV and how they're experiencing IPV-related homicides at high rates. We're thinking about transgender and gender nonconforming and non-binary survivors who are causing harm and the barriers that they're experiencing trying to access services that can actually help with interventions. Next slide. Am I going too fast now? Okay. So thinking about IPV, intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community, we know that it is as prevalent and deadly as in, mainstream communities, or what we would consider mainstream communities. We know that LGBTQ survivors often face additional obstacles to safety, to support and services. And we know this because of the bias and the discrimination and the fact that programming really does not take into account the unique dynamics of power and control that a survivor experiencing intimate partner violence might face. We also know that folks that are causing harm are also don't have access to spaces where they can actually talk about the harm that they're causing and talk about their identities and also talk about the harm that they've experienced, right? So it's really thinking about these moments that we can capture and create to fully take in the survivor that we're working with and see how violence is impacting them uniquely, and then also look at people causing harm and how they are also experiencing unique dynamics of power in their life and harm in their lives too, and as a way to hold them accountable. So our safety planning with LGBTQ people around intimate partner violence, we think about for survivors and those causing harm, we look at this as a multi-layered planning, right? We always think about identity. We're asking about their identity. We're asking who knows about their identity. Who are they out to? Because we don't know. We don't know what their world looks like. We don't know what that landscape looks like and the support systems that they have and the relationships that they have. We're looking at the physical, emotional, financial, spiritual, and relational, right? We're not just stopping at one. We're trying to really think about all of it and thinking about how are we pulling in all of this into the conversations as we center the person we're working at. Big city, small world. We're from New York City. Y'all, it's big. And as big as it is, as small as it can feel, right? Because queer community is small, believe it or not. And so we are in space a lot and we're seeing people, we're seeing the same people. So what does it mean to safety plan and to think about more restorative approaches when we're looking at folks who are causing harm and talking with folks and being in those spaces? Always survivor-centered and strengths-based. I know that we hear that ad nauseum, but really thinking about what does that mean? And thinking about restorative and transformative justice approaches. That is, in theory, amazing. And I know that many of us do it. And in practice, it is not easy. And I know that we can talk about that more throughout this conversation. I would love to really unpack that. And just thinking about what does this look like, safety planning, ongoing, responsive and not in reaction to, that can move, right? Like bamboo does in the wind, that it's not just concrete, that it's really, again, looking at the person's day-to-day and how best to support that. And I think my time is up.
Thank you so much, Darlene and Barbara and Maddalynn and Kunane. Amazing. This panel is a redux of a panel we did actually to a group of folks in Hawaii a few months ago, many months ago. Time is a weird soup. And every time I listen to these folks talk, I learn something new. So I really want to thank you all for what you've brought. It's such a rich conversation. So I'm sure that each of us have heard information maybe that was new to us today. And in a moment, I'm going to ask the panelists to start our conversation by sharing what questions, worries, and ideas are coming up for you. And while you collect your thoughts and think about what you want to talk about, I'd also like to ask the audience to share in this process and share your questions in the Q&A section, your worries, your ideas. We'll highlight some of those during our discussion, and just continue to put those in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I do want to say we do have a question, but I wanted to give folks just a minute to share any initial thoughts or anything you're sitting with right now that you want to make sure, now that you've listened to your colleagues, that you want to make sure you say. And if no one has anything, we can move on to those questions. But I'd like to give some folks space first.
Well, I don't have a comment, but I do want to lift up the comment in the chat about information on your pup back there. Inquiring minds want to know.
That's Papula. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was not taking a peek at the chat. That is Papula puppy, and she likes to be near me when I'm on screen most of the time. So she is a almost 5-year-old mini poodle and is my empty nest solution. Thank you for noticing her. So one of the questions that did come up that I'm just going to put out there, and folks can take this where you'd like it, but this came up with folks submitting questions when they registered. So intervention work has been highly gendered. responsive to a feminist analysis of gender-based violence. What does moving beyond binaries look like and offer us, knowing that gender and domination remain important in relationship where harm occurs? Does the use of language, such as gender-based violence itself, go against the idea of those who cause harm, or can we recognize the preponderance and realities of intimate partner violence while at the same time treating individuals as human beings? And then there's a follow-up question that says, should we be concerned about unintended consequences about the language that we use? I'll just start by saying I think we always have to be aware that there are unintended consequences of language we choose, also that language is evolving. The language that we used when I used to work with Darlene and AVP, the language we used when I started there in 2010 is not the language we use today. The language I used in queer community in the 80s is not the language we use today. So we know that language, as well as our experiences and our understandings, evolve, right? So I'd love to hear from the panel any thoughts you have about that. What does moving beyond binaries look like and offer us in a way that still can hold the complexities of our historical understanding of violence in this very gendered lens? I'd love to hear from anybody who'd like to start.
Okay, I will quickly say that the work that we're doing, we have to establish trust so quickly, right? What a gift it is that someone has come to us for services, for support, and what a gift we can give to someone to fully respect who they are in the space. And what better way than the use of language to do that, right? It doesn't even matter if we don't know someone's pronoun. We don't have to use a pronoun. We can just say their name. I think sometimes as workers, as providers, and this is with good intentions, we get really caught up with the technicalities of language, right? Because we want to show respect, we want to be respectful, we want to make sure that the community knows that we know this term for this, yes. And it doesn't matter, really. The education, yes, is important, but in that moment, it's really just about how am I establishing trust in nanoseconds as quickly as I can. And I don't even want to say safety, right? It's really for me just like maybe trust, some comfort for them to be able to say the name that they want to use, for us to check in and say, hey, on this sign-in sheet, I see you use Darlene. Is that the name you'd like for me to use with you today while we're talking together? Like just checking in with each other. And so the power of language and the power of checking in really for me just means that hopefully it will create a space where that person's going to look at us and say, okay, maybe I can let my wall down. All right. Yeah. We're all checking for that, for safety in one way or another. So I'll pass it on to Kunane since you went off mic and I didn't notice.
Thank you. It's okay. I mean, so what both of you shared is so important. And I think, Kat, when you mentioned what we used back in the early days, or just is different from what some words have a different, people respond differently. So let's take the word queer, right? I mean, my generation, that was a very negative word. When I heard that, and even the word mahu at one point, when I heard that, it meant I was going to have to fight. And so now, though, people have really reclaimed some of these words and have a very positive identity and connection to some of these words, but some of us still are working through that. So when I hear sometimes that word queer, the hairs on the back of my neck start to twitch a little, right? So I think depending on who's sitting in front of you, right, that it's come for support, for services, or even just talking to you in the coffee shop that you happen to run into, realizing or having the understanding or just the awareness that words mean different things to different people. And I'm old school, I say LGBT, but today there's LGBTQIA plus and on, and people gravitate and I connect with something with one across the spectrum, right? And the binary and everything like that. So somehow finding out what it is that I'm going to use when I talk story with Darlene, and what's the language and the vocabulary and the conversation going to look like when I'm talking to Barbara or Maddie, right? What does that look like? Because unintentionally, we can create sometimes a little bit of uneasiness. And it's just awareness on our part. And then when they see that intention, then we do create a safe space, right? They say, oh, this person actually does want to know who I am and what's going on just beyond my current situation, whatever that may be. And that's such a gift to have when we share time and space with someone. Yeah. So thank you for raising that also.
Barbara?
Yeah, those are such great comments. I just had, one other quick comment to add. And when we are working with people and as we're even thinking about language, what we also want to think about is the language of the body and thinking about developing rapport, developing trust. How am I showing up? How do I look? Because we know that people, especially who have experienced trauma, are always on the lookout for cues of safety and cues of danger. And so even a frowny face or a tense body could make a person feel like it's not a safe space. And I think it's also important to think about things like staying just a step or two behind so that the person that we're working with can lead the conversation and determine what things they want to bring forward, what things they want to make meaning of, and really working to co-create that meaning rather than deciding what a particular thing does or does not mean, because that's the work of the person that's sitting in front of us. And then my final comment is good use of silence. Let the person think about what matters to them in the moment and give some space to let it land and again decide what it means together.
Thanks, Barbara. I just want to say that I have Darlene's voice permanently in my brain when I'm in a group with participants or even with staff and there's silence. And I know I need to let it go on a little longer than makes me comfortable in order to make sure that I'm not filling the space in reaction to my own anxiety. And it is something that making space and sitting in silence is so useful. I did want to say two things too that I'm sparked by that I'm hearing from you all as well. I think it was so clear in all three presentations, the importance of believing survivors and believing people who come in for services and support in shifting their behavior to be less violent, that we believe them when they tell us who we are. And that sounds very basic, but I don't always know that's understood. And I think in particular, in this moment in time when there is such public backlash against LGBTQ and IA+ and MAHU identities and communities, that it's essential that we just remind ourselves that part of that respect and making space is not having to be perfect with the language, because that's a white supremacist construct we can ignore, but to be present. And I think when Barbara talks about embodied presence, to really make that connection that Kunane and Maddie and Darlene talked about. So I just want to remind you all in the audience that you can get more training, you can get more support, but that the perfection is not the goal. Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, no, that's my dog bark. I think that's absolutely right, though. In relationships, there are going to be ruptures. We are going to make mistakes. And I think we don't want to be so fearful of making mistakes that we just don't do anything, that we become paralyzed. And when we make mistakes, it does not mean that we're bad advocates. It just means that we hopefully are doing our best and that we have the courage and we allow ourselves a vulnerability to apologize and share the intent to get it right, whatever right looks like for the person that we're working with.
So I want to make sure we have time for a couple more questions. A question came up, a theme came up in the people who submitted questions in advance, and some of that is coming up in the Q&A as well. I wonder if you each could speak to the way that you see when you're working with people who are causing harm, and when you're working with survivors. But I think there's some particular dynamics here when people's internalized responses to the oppression that they have experienced show up in the dynamics of their intimate relationships, and how that can be translated into intimate partner violence. And we talked about this quite a bit in one of our prep calls. If anybody would like to speak to that, because I think it's a particular issue for diverse LGBTQIA plus communities who are at the intersections, to bring up some information from our earlier panel that I was on this morning, that there are folks who are particularly vulnerable, both who are causing harm in their relationships and who are receiving harm in their relationships. If you could speak to that internalized response to oppression and how that might show up in dynamics, any of you, I'd love to hear that.
So I can quickly, sorry, I was just writing down when you were finishing up. I ran a group called Transform. It's a non-mandated group for people who caused harm through sexual violence, who identified as LGBTQ. And it was the only non-mandated group in the country that at that time existed. It was pretty incredible. And in the group, we really talked a lot about holistic accountability, right? And part of that meant that we had to talk about the harm that they experienced. And a lot of folks in that group discussed their own internalized response to oppression and how being, if they identified as trans or non-binary, a lot of the harm that they experienced from family, from loved ones, and how they internalized just not being good, right? Not being worthy, not being worth being respected, not being able to hold good or healthy relationships because they're bad, right? A lot of these negative messages that they received around their gender identity and their sexual orientation were so present in these conversations. And by unpacking that, really offered us the opportunity to talk about the choices that they've made to harm people, right, in their relationships. And this was a 15-week group. There was a lot of unpacking, obviously, but it really was an incredible experience. And for me, very eye-opening to be able to offer space for folks to actually talk about the things that has hurt them and the ways that they've experienced harm and oppression. We know, what the goal of is that, right? And then how that in turn did offer these opportunities for them to cause harm. And again, not as a way to excuse it, but really to better understand their behavior and their responses.
Yeah, thank you for that, Darlene. One thing that I'd like to add to that is, and maybe to an unpopular opinion, I know that, as I was saying before, that violence is culturally supported. It absolutely is. And it's also what happens when people are dysregulated. So violence is sometimes a person's best attempt to cope with what feels like overwhelm in their nervous system. And many people who have experienced oppression, this sense of overwhelmed, this alarm of the nervous system, the sense of I'm not safe enough, I'm not good enough, people are out to get me, the sense of hypervigilance kind of lives in the body. And sometimes it can just be so uncomfortable that the connection to choice is lost. And so when we are in that state of hypervigilance, it can feel like, even though my intent in this moment is not to cause harm, I feel so uncomfortable in my body that I just want to do something with the energy. And I haven't had enough space or support to be able to manage these feelings or disclose these feelings or work through these feelings so that I can discharge them in a way that's more skillful. And then there's this really painful loop where I do this thing that I don't want to do, and then I feel more shame. And so then I'm caught in this experience where even though I tell myself I'm not going to do it again, I do it again. And so we really want to be mindful that there are no throwaway people, and we can feel like we want to throw away people when they cause harm, but we all belong to the same community and we do have a responsibility to each other. And so I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Barbara. I think that really leads us into another question that we have, which is, how do we create a space for those that cause harm to feel safe, or at least to feel safer? How do we address the cultural factors that desensitize communities that desensitize us to cause to harm. I think that you both spoke to that. I think you've all spoken to that at some point. So how do we create space, and how do we begin to counteract that desensitization to violence within our culture, do folks think?
Yeah, this comes up a lot for us when we're working with people who have received harm. It's at the point where often they can't even talk about the person who has harmed them because people make you feel like there's something wrong with you for having love for this person. And so, what we remind people about is that we're not talking about monsters, we're talking about human beings who have a range of behaviors. And so I think we might think about this even in our own experiences. There are things that we have in our own minds that we feel shame about, things that we wish we could do better. And that inner critic can lead us to believe that we are not good, that we are bad people for this reason or that reason. And try to think about the compassion that we would want for ourselves if people could see all of our wounds and our flaws and really offer that same open heartedness and that same compassion for other people because everybody's walking with something. And we really would do well to let people be seen in their fullness rather than the things that they get wrong because we're all getting something wrong.
I think for us, Kuana, I think it's so important to have these spaces and to have like community groups to where they can vent what they have to say if there's when there's issues or topics that need to be discussed, especially when it comes to domestic violence. Sometimes our groups, our folks aren't comfortable talking in big groups or with strangers, but they're so comfortable talking within their group. You know, here we have Kuana Project, we have a Napoy Lima group, which is for our elders. We have a Beauty Blossoms for our youths. We have a group for our reentry folks. And so, you know, leaving these spaces, and sometimes it can get a little crazy. Sometimes they get very vocal, but at the end of all these discussions, we're able to come to a realization how to use our words instead of always being angry or always being violent, and how powerful those words can be. And so by creating these little subgroups within their community and having them be vocal and be a part of it and being part of these solutions really, you know, for us, it helps motivate them to want to do better, to want to be a voice in the community. So by creating these little these safe spaces for them to have these groups and to have these discussions is very important, and it really helps our people to have a better understanding to how powerful words can be instead of always being angry. Because I'm sorry, transgender folks, we've been traumatized, so much injustice that we built with decades, and we have this wall. And by us having these groups, it allows us to vent, sometimes get loud, but it always helps us to bring us together and to always come with some sort of solution and how we can use it in a better way. So that's just my input. I hope it made any sense, but yeah.
And I just want to add really quickly, because when I saw this question and about how do we create a space for those who have caused harm to feel safe. You know, here in Hawaii, our Native Hawaiian, and in New Zealand, there's a lot of work being done with people who have caused harm to reconnect ourselves with our cultural identity, right? As a Native Hawaiian, as a Maori person, right? And it is this revitalization of identity of our culture, this cultural identity, cultural practices, and things like that. Because pre-Western, we didn't have this intimate partner violence going on in the sense that or maybe it's just not that. But what we do know is we see a shift in our people who are once they get this, they reclaim their cultural identity. And I'm Native Hawaiian Chinese white. I look white. I walk through this world. People think I'm just white, but I have this really strong connection to my culture and my heritage and my ancestors, right? And when we have that, it changes the way we see ourselves and maybe the way we carry ourselves. And we're seeing a shift with individuals that are reconnecting with their culture, with their history, with their identity, their ancestors, in a turnaround when it comes to what they used to do and who they were and the way they move forward in life now. No longer creating and causing that harm that they once did. So cultural connection and identity is so important. And we see that a lot here in Hawaii and also in New Zealand. We're seeing a lot of practice happening, cultural practices.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate that. I think we talked about that in our first panel this morning. So it really is, it's been a thread throughout the day, the reconnecting to one's cultural practices and community as a means of, and I'll just put my own words to it, I think, of regaining our humanity. And what I appreciate about transformative justice perspectives when we're thinking about repairing harm through around racism, around interpersonal violence, around intimate partner violence, the idea that we all have humanity and we may have to get back to it once we've caused harm. There's some real weight to that. We have a lot of really great questions that have come up in the chat, so I'm going to try to get to some of those. The first one is, Barbara, if you could share a little bit more about the Sisters program, the aftercare program that you all have. Someone was particularly interested in hearing more about that.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad to. So it's survivors in service to extend resiliency. And what we're really trying to do, because often when you survive intimate partner violence, domestic violence, you are isolated from your community and your sense of support. It's a group of people who have received services who are now gathered together regularly to focus on things like self-care, service, leadership, learning. So we've done volunteer projects. For example, we've gone to a senior community to play bingo. We've gone hiking and zip lining. We have each Tuesday evening at 7, a Zoom group. Our theme this month is falling in love with the woman I am and the woman I am becoming. And we are next month going to be focused on entrepreneurship. We also have a podcast. It's called Sister Stories. And what we were really concerned with doing as a part of the podcast is uncovering some of the stigma that's associated with surviving, having people think differently about what survivors look like, who they are. We all have assumptions about this. And so this is an opportunity for survivors in their own words to talk about what their journey has been. And what we're really trying to do is emphasize them or highlight them as experts of their own experience, because I think people have ideas about what you're supposed to do. And we really wanted to create something where women said, this is what I did. Maybe it's not what you will do, but if I can do it, you can do it too. Or if it has been done, it can be done. So we're really just trying to, create spaces where survivors can let their voices be heard and highlighted. So.
Thank you so much. I wonder, one of the things that has come up in the questions is what we can do. Again, I want us to think about this as a group of people specifically working to intervene with people who have caused harm through intimate partner violence. So what do we need to do to bring about that necessary change in language, in curriculum? Is there a recommended curriculum? What are some ideas that you all might have to suggest for people who are trying to make that shift from a traditional cis heteronormative model with maybe outdated language into a more integrated, inclusive, beyond the binaries approach that would be inclusive and affirming of LGBTQIA plus diverse people who had caused harm?
Yeah, I'd say rely on the people that we are serving to convene in committees. We have at the Women's Resource Center is an advisory board of people who have received services. And so I think, unfortunately, what has happened over the last 20 years or so is that the work has become very professionalized and only people who have certain credentials can do it. But we really want to, and other people might want to contribute as well, but I think we really want to include people who have lived experiences. We want to invite them to the table to help us think about what new curriculum can look like and how we might be able to evolve different ways of talking about and thinking about the work that we're doing.
I love that. I think to add to that, I think it's important to have really honest, transparent conversations with each other and keep it real with yourself. I think that when we were preparing to hold this group, there was a lot of pushback from staff because folks were like, I started working here because we serve survivors. I don't want to serve somebody that causes harm. We were trying to find space for this group, and a lot of spaces in other organizations that I was asking didn't want to have the group there or offer their space for us to have the group, right? Because what would that mean to the survivors that they serve, knowing that they were holding their group there? So it was a lot of aha moments because I was like, we are all talking the talk, but what happened to walking the walk here? And so it was a moment that humbled me and made me also think about for myself, like, what does this shift in my thinking require in my spirit? Right? As a survivor of many things too, myself, right? And what does it mean for me to hold space like this? And then how can I support also my colleagues in shifting? And what are the conversations that we need to have? So I think that really intentionally creating space with each other, whether it's at a retreat or something or a staff meeting, to really audit yourselves and think about, are we ready to hold space for people who cause harm? Are we ready to offer these services? What do we need to do in order to do that? And what is that commitment going to look like? That's what my experience has been, and that's what I think has been really useful.
Thank you. One question that's come up in a couple of different ways from folks in the audience is the idea of, should we be doing LGBTQ specific groups or should we be doing LGBTQ inclusive groups? So is the preferred model having a closed group with LGBTQ folks, which can cause challenges for some programs that may be in communities where they may not have enough to make a cohort, or is it better to create inclusive programming? And any thoughts you have on that as well?
I'm going to just chime in really quickly. So I think it is really knowing your community and who's coming into your program. And at that time, even, because it doesn't have to be set in stone forever, but when I think of our Mahu community, and they blend well. We blend well with a mixed group sometimes, right? But then we also know that sometimes the situation, what's being discussed is very specific. So like Napui Lima, which is for our ladies of a gracious age, they're going to talk about something that might be different than someone younger or might want to talk about. So it really, when it comes down to our LGBT communities or groups, I think for me, it depends on what the group is, the purpose of the group. Will people learn from each other or be supported by each other, that we can mix them up, whether they're heterosexual, cisgender, LGBT, Mahu, right? And I mean, here in Hawaii, that cultural piece lends itself to be supportive in this arena, to have a combined group. But we also know that we have to have a safe space sometimes, specifically for a group of individuals or people who are looking for support, that need to be just amongst their peers for a while. So it's really as flexible as you can be to support the community. And sometimes that in itself is a challenge, just because of staffing or time or things like that. But how do we juggle all these moving pieces while keeping our person, our people, in the forefront of what's going to happen next? Yeah.
Thanks, Kunane. I appreciate you. Barbara, did you unmute to jump in, or were you just?
Oh, no,
Okay,
just
checking.
appreciating Kunane's comments. Yeah.
Wonderful. We have another question that I wanted to share that really connects, I think, culture as a means to healing with historical trauma. And the person asks, when thinking about connecting to culture as a means to healing, it makes me think about barriers that may come up when thinking about ancestry for African American folks. And this is an explicit reference to people who were enslaved and may not know where their ancestors are from. I'm wondering if folks have thoughts in general about that or in specific about that.
Yeah, I had a quick thought. One of the things that has been helpful for me is not necessarily thinking about ancestors from my particular bloodline. I can choose who I want my ancestors to be. So we talk about family of origin and also family of choice. And so as you are creating your altar, you can decide who you'd like to be on the altar based on what kind of connection you feel like you have with them. And so this is an opportunity where we can choose who we want to be as a part of our ancestral family, and we can make that connection however feels right for us. That's something that has been helpful for me.
Thanks, Barbara. Reminds me of Kunane when you talked about Ohana and Hanai earlier. And we talk about this a lot in queer community. Many people are disconnected from their own family of origin, and they've created a family of their own. And I think that can be very useful as well and listening to someone about who they think those ancestors would be and how would they think about that. Darlene, did I talk over you? Did you want to say something? I'm sorry. Awesome. One of the things that people are asking about as well is, and then I want to do this quickly if we can, and then get to closing statements from each of you. But what do you think, what would you all offer as some of the best practices for supporting LGBTQIA plus survivors of violence in a group therapy setting? And how can group therapy help to foster healing and resilience for this community? I know you've all spoken about this to some extent already, so just whatever you'd like to add.
I mean, I think Maddie and Kunani really spoke to this really well, right? I think that we know as folks run groups that a group is quote unquote successful when it takes the life of its own, right? When folks feel comfortable to share, when folks feel seen and supported, and when folks are able to bring their true selves into the space. So much of the work of survivors is really trying to figure out, do I bring my false self into this space because it's safer to do that? Or can I bring my true self into the space? And I think that group therapy can really offer those opportunities for folks to be in community in a way that they may not have access to, opportunities, or experience before, especially if they don't have community or family, that accepts them truly for who they are. And in this space, that might be that opportunity for that. And to also talk about the harm that they've experienced, whatever the group is focusing on, or talk about where do you get your clothes from? I love that outfit. Like, where can I get my hair? Like, where's a safe spot for me to get my cut or my shape up or my hair, my extensions, like whatever it is that folks need for themselves and whatever kind of group folks are running. I think that for me is like the beauty of group work and creating that space or supporting that space to be created.
Barbara, did you want to add something? No.
No.
Fair. I'd love to take this moment, if everybody would be comfortable, as we close out this first day of this conference, this amazing conference, and this really wonderful panel. It was so wonderful to be in space with you all. I'd love to just hear from you all with specific closing statements, what you'd like to leave the group with as we head out, more thinking about moving beyond the binaries to support people who have caused harm, who also are part of LGBTQIA plus and Mahu communities, to heal and to have healthy relationships. So anything you'd like to say as you close, this is your time. Barbara, I'm going to start with you because you're unmuted.
Oh, sure. Okay. So I'll just start by saying thank you all so much for the work that you are doing. I think as citizens of the world, being able to see yourself as a person who can make a difference is really powerful. And so thank you for taking up the charge. Thank you for making the choice. And then the last thing I'll say is that the best way that we can be good advocates is to work with ourselves first. You know, the work really does begin within. So I encourage everyone to mine your own inner landscape and find out what's there so that it doesn't show up in your interactions in a way that you're not aware of. Because of course we are going to cause, there's going to be harm that we cause. Hopefully it will be unintentional, and we'll be able to find ways to recognize where that's happening. We'll be able to see it as it's happening, and we'll have the courage to make things better, to make amends in that moment. And then the last thing I'll say is just let yourself slow down really and be present with the people that you are working with, because many things will be said that you'll need time to process. And also there will be things that will be communicated not through words, and you don't want to miss it because it's a really vulnerable opportunity when a person is in front of you. When things fall apart, people are more likely to share things maybe that they would not have in a different kind of a setting. So you have a unique opportunity to be available to someone, and don't squander it. It's really powerful, and it can make a huge difference in the world if a person is in front of someone who cares about them, sees them, and is committed to their healing.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to go to you, Darlene.
Thank you, Ashley. That was so beautiful. I have goosebumps. I love being in space with y'all. I think to add to that, you are all here and you're here for a reason, right? And so you're doing the work already. If I looked at the numbers right, I think there's almost 300 people that's on this webinar. So network with each other. Like, it doesn't matter if we're across the country. What matters is that we are here. And so we are a resource to you. You are a resource to each other. I think acknowledge what you don't know and be okay with that, because you're not going to be able to get what you need unless you can acknowledge what you don't know. And I think the obvious things, like we can share resources, we can share TA, we are your support system. And I think trust your spirit, right? Like, you're doing this work, you have good intuition. And as Barbara said, if you make a mistake, okay, it's okay, as long as we learn from it and we acknowledge the impact. And I think seek support and community, because this is too difficult to do alone. And again, we are part of the community now with you.
Thank you, Darlene. Maddie, did you want to share a parting statement, or should we just go to Kunane?
These people said it all. That was really beautiful. Thank you, Darlene and Barbara. That was really amazing. And they're so right. You folks are here, and that's the first step of wanting to do better for your community. So thank you all for being here and for being amazing. And sometimes we have to kind of like, I think the only thing I would say is just check our privilege. What is easy for us may not be easy for someone else. But that's all I can add to what these beautiful, amazing ladies already stated. Yeah, thank you for being here. Appreciate you all.
Thank you, Maddalynn. Kunane, you want to take us home?
Sure. You know, what I always think of, and this was such an amazing panel to hear these words, and again to have it says 234. That's amazing people here and it's on the
At
East
the end
Coast,
of the
right?
day.
So what is it? It's 5:30 now over there, where some people are. So thank you. But you know what I think about is two things. One is just always remember the person sitting in front of us comes with so many different experiences, whether it's cultural background as Native Hawaiian or whatever cultural identity they have, their heritage, right? When I think of New York City, that's just a melting pot of people and culture. And I love, and then we come with these other identities, whether it's LGBT, cisgender, straight, whatever it may be, mahu. But learning who is in front of us, you will make the most powerful difference for you as a helper, right? As a provider. You just don't know, right? When we just kind of assume, right? Here's this white guy sitting in front of me, right? When people look at me, the assumption is that I'm this white guy, and it's, yeah, but that's not my only identity, right? All of these things come. And that's so important when I feel valued when people want to learn more about me. I feel that I value people when I want to learn more about them and who they are. And that makes the biggest difference. And we just have to, if we can just learn how to, we say in Hawaiian, malama each other, right? Take care of each other. This world will be a better place, right? The world is going to look to aloha to solve its problems. That was a big saying around it. And I truly believe that it's with aloha and you don't have to be Hawaiian to practice that, but it's with that whole spirit of aloha that we can make a difference in the world. Mahalo for being here. Thank you.
Whew, I got goosies from this whole time. You all are so wonderful. And I want to also thank our friends at CJI for helping to put this together. And I want to leave you with a quote that's often attributed to Lila Watson, but Lila Watson actually said, it's not my quote, it's the Queensland Aboriginal group. It's collective wisdom. But she said, if you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think for me, I really sit with that all the time. And it's what keeps me going in this time that is a difficult time for so many. And to be in space with all of you, all 300 of you, and all of us on screen, and know that we are working together and working in that aloha spirit means the world. So thank you all so much.